Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we are learning Maseches Menachos Daf Kuf Zayin and up to the Mishnah on Kuf Ches Amud Aleph. So we have about a blot and a half to cover, maybe a pinch more. We're starting at the Mishnah toward the bottom of Kuf Vav Amud Beis, keeping our eye on the prize here, finishing the Masechta Yirtzeh Hashem on Thursday night. So of course tonight to the bottom of Kuf Ches Amud Aleph. And tomorrow's daf is pretty long. Kuf Ches is big. We need to get to the top of Kuf Tes Amud Beis, and then the last night we'll learn the final blot of the Masechta on Thursday. We'll have to speak to Reb Yitz, who's here on Zoom. We'll talk about our whatever you're going to be cooking, but we'll talk about that another time. Don't shake your head. You're cooking. You're cooking. Okay, says the Mishnah toward the bottom of Kuv Vav Amud Beis. Harei alai eitzim. If a person says that they wanted to bring wood, the halacha is lo yivchos mishnei gzirin. You have to bring 2 blocks of wood. Levona lo yivchos mikometz. If you said you're going to bring levona, at least it has to be the share of a kometz of the kmitza. Chamisha kmatzim him. There are 5 types of kmatzim. Haomer harei alai levona lo yivchos mikometz. If a person says that they're going to bring a levona, they need a kmitza. Hamenadev or hamisnadev mincha. If someone says they're bringing a mincha, yavi ima kometz levona, you need to again bring another kmitza of levona. Hamale es hakometz bachutz chayv. If somebody brings a kmitza outside of a holy area, they will be held accountable. If somebody says shnei bazichin, tu'unen shnei kmatzim. So these are 5 different types of kmatzim. We're not going to get into the details now, but you should read the Kahati. It just adds a lot of the appropriate color. Person says, I want to make a donation of gold to the Beis Hamikdash. You need to do at least 1 dinar. Kesef, if you said kesef, but you were inarticulate, you didn't say exactly what amount. Lo yivchos mi dinar kesef. We'll discuss this more in the Gemara. L'choshes, a person wants to bring this material. Lo yivchos mi ma'a kesef. You have to make sure that you bring a ma of kesef of that particular material. What if a person says pirash ma pirashi in regards to one of these metals of gold, silver, and choshes? A fascinating svara. Keep giving, take out dollar bills and say, all right, I'm up to 20, I'm up to 25. And then there's going to be that point where you're like, no, I would never have given more than this. So that's when you stop. And that is what the Gemara recommends. We just finished the Mishnah. We are at the bottom of Kuf Vav Amud Beis, at the first of the long lines. Says the Gemara as follows: Tanu Rabbanan, the pasuk says, "Korban malamish misnadven eitzim." From here, we see that one is allowed to donate wood to the Beis Hamikdash. V'kama shnei gzirin. We already said in our Mishnah. The Brisa is just reflecting this, and this was actually quoted earlier in the Masechta as well. V'chein hu omer. We know that a korban is valid to be eitzim because the pasuk says, "V'agoralo sipalnu al korban ha'eitzim." So we see these 2 words are put next to one another, and therefore we know that eitzim are a korban. Rebbe Omer Eitzim Korbanhim. He says they really are a korban, and tu'unan melach u'tu'unan hagasha. Unbelievable. If somebody says harei alai that I'm going to be bringing wood, you treat it as you would an animal. You put salt on it. It's not even a food. You put salt on it. It requires hagasha. Has to be brought next to the mizbech. Amar Rava, let's take him a little bit further. L'divrei Rebbe. According to Rebbe, who says that eitzim is considered to be an actual korban, tu'unan kmitza. And Rashi points out that you would grind it down and you would take a kmitza. Amar Papa l'divrei Rebbe eitzim tzrichim eitzim. If you bring a korban of eitzim, it can't be the lower level of wood. It needs to be put on top of wood to be burned by the wood of the mizbech because it's treated the same way that an animal would be treated, which is that it's put on top of the wood. Fascinating. We had said in our Mishnah, Levono liyivchos min hakometz. How do we know this? Minol on 5 lines from the bottom on Kuvav Amud Beis. The pasuk says, we see that Levona is compared to mincha. Maharama de mincha kometz. Just like when one is doing kmitza, just like one is bringing a korban mincha, they have to do kometz. Af Levona nami kometz. So we see a hekesh in the psukim between Levona and Harama de Mincha. Next, 3 lines from the bottom, Tan Rabbanan. What if a person just says Harei alai lemizbeach? So then the halacha is Yavi Levona. You have to bring Levona. She'en lecha davar shekarv legabe mizbeach ela Levona. The only thing that's fully consumed on a mizbeach, nothing compares to Levona. We'll question that in a minute. We know an Ola is Khalil. We're going to question that in a moment. But before we get there, we need to finish this brisa because we said Harei alai lemizbeach. And then the next part of that brisa is in the same vein, is Pirash Veni Odem Ma Pirashti. If somebody says, I want to give something to the mizbech, I just don't know what it is. Yavim Kol Davar Shekarv LeMizbech. You can bring from anything that needs to go on the mizbech. Your language is is broad, but you need to bring any something that would have been brought on the mizbech, and then you have to check that box because you made a nedava, you made a neder. So says the Gemara, I don't understand. You just said that levona. If you look back onto the third line from the bottom, it says she'ein lecha davar shekarav legabe mizbech ela levona. Nothing's like levona in the way that it's completely consumed v'sulek. Are you sure? Va'ika ola. We know that the ola is something that's fully consumed on the mizbech. Why would you say levona is more? Says the Gemara, because we need to know the nuances of halacha as well. Ika or lekohanim. Says the Gemara that we know that the hides of the animal are given to the kohanim. The olas ha'of is also brought in its kalil, says the Gemara. Ika, turning to the top of Kuf Zayin Amud Aleph Mo Rav Notzel, the crop, which was part of the digestive tract of the bird. The notes and the feathers were not in, but the whole levon was in. What about nisachim, the libations that were poured on the mizbech? Says the Gemara, those didn't burn up. L'shitan azli, they went down into the pipes, they went down into the drainage system that they had on the mizbech. We know, of course, from much, much earlier in Shas that the Pirchei Kohanim, the young kids would go down and they would remove at times these clods of congealed wine. So it didn't all get burned up. That's what the Gemara says. Va'ika minchas nesachim. There was a minchas nesachim, which was a korban mincha that had oil, and in fact it was burned up. Says the Gemara, you're right. It's true. It was similar to the levona in that way that it was all burned up. However, 2 lines down, kevanika mincha de'achle kohanim inei lo psikale. Since a korban mincha in general is edible, we therefore don't want to have that be the category. So that's why the levona gets the special phrase. It's interesting we got this far in Shas until we learned about this. We've talked about ola being kalil 1,000 times. All of a sudden, we show up on Menachos Kuvav. We're like, no, the levona is more kalil than an ola. I never would have thought. I know we always talk about it as being the dogma of that which is kalil. So we're wrong. The answer is that levona is a little bit more kalil. 3 lines down on Kuv Zayin Aleph says the Gemara, Harei alai zav lo yivchos midin arzav. Says the Gemara, V'dil manascha. How do you know you're talking about a coin? Maybe we're talking about just a nugget of gold or a brick of gold. How do you know we're talking about a coin? Says the Gemara, we have a new kimta. Amar Rebbe Lazar, Amar matbeya. He specified that it was coin. What does that mean? Let's make our diuk that had he not specified, it could have been a nascha. That's taka true. That's true. I have a dilma priti. Let's move in the other direction. Maybe it wasn't a nascha, this large block of gold, and maybe it also wasn't a coin, but maybe perhaps it was priti, which is a smaller coin, let's say a penny relative to a quarter. Mechatesi that it's a regular matbeya. Maybe it's a smaller priti if all you would have said is gold. Amara papa, priti dedava lo avdeinchi. People don't make coins that are gold in that material. We have this in our coins. Nickel is made out of nickel. Pennies made out of whatever. So not every coin is made in every denomination. It just depends on the value of that particular coin. And they did not make gold coins as prite. So therefore, there's no reasonable reason to assume that when a person says Harei alai zav that he meant a coin that they don't even mint. So that for sure is not the case. 8 lines down, Kesef le'yivchos midin Abdil Manasa. How do we know that by silver? We weren't talking about a block of silver. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Lazar, same Rabbi Lazar, Damar matbeya, because we assume we have a new kimta that he said matbeya. I have a dilma priti. Maybe we should say he's talking about a smaller coin, says the Gemara. Amar of Sheshes, Asra de lo sago priti de kasba. We're talking about a locale where there was no priti de kasba. There were no small coins like that were made out of silver. Let's make our inference now. We're learners. So had it been that you were in a locale that did have smaller coins, perhaps you'd be yotze with that. Maybe you don't have to bring a matbeh. Maybe you can bring a priti shel kesef. That could be possible. Nechoshes b'sad lo yivchos mimo kesef. How do we know this? Tanya. Gemara says, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Amar lo yivchos mitzinor ketana shel nechoshes. We need to have a little tiny little spinning fork, a little tiny little thing that was made out of nechoshes. L'may what was the usage of such a thing in order for something to be a functional kli? It needs to have a function. Says the Gemara, Amar Abai shemechatitim ba psilos u'mekanchin baneros. We would use it to cut the wicks for the menorah, and we would use it to clean out the menorahs. Remember, we learned how bendable the menorahs were, if you recall back from a couple of blot ago, maybe a dozen blot ago. I don't remember exactly when it was. What about barzel? Now we have an addition, iron. We weren't talking about this before. What about barzel? Tanya mi kalya orev. You go to the Kosel Amaravi, even today, you'll see that in certain places they have these spikes sitting upward so pigeons don't land on. That's exactly what this is. This is not new technology. They had this in the times of the Gemara. Bekama. What? Yeah, that's what this is. Gemara. The Gemara here is referring actually to that example. This reference of Kali Orev was that it was used in the Beis Hamikdash. Absolutely. Where was it again? On the tops of the Kodesh of the Heichal. Of the Heichal they had it, but the meat wasn't there. I guess there was meat there, but there's meat everywhere. I remember we said that the meat was in like the whole entire Azora area behind the, yeah. That's a miracle that it wasn't overtaken by bugs and animals. It's a nice nigla. That's not normal. So that's what the Gemara says. V'kama, what's the shiur of this? Kalya orev of this these spikes, says the Gemara. Amar Rav Yosef, ama al ama, and Ikad Amri. Some say that it was reversed. Lo yivchos mi ama al ama, lo ma'chazio. Amar Rav Yosef, la kalya orev. Why did we have to invert? That's not pronounced. That's fine, but ask in the Rishonim. Go take a look. That brings us to the next mission, a third of the way down. Kuf Zayin Amud Aleph. The Gemara says as follows: Harei alai yain. If a person makes a commitment to bring yain, lo yivchos mishlosh lugin. Minimum is 3 lug. Why? Rashi, 12 lines down. Dibra maschil harei layayin lenusachin. I'm bringing wine for libations. Liifchos mishlosh shalugin shein pchusin shebenusachin. It's the small. So remember, we said yesterday we had ram, we had keves, ayil, and para. I think were the 3 animals we were talking about. Anyways, that's the smallest. What about shemen? Lo yivchos milug. By oil, if a person says harei alai shemen, minimum is 1 lug. Rabbi Omer shlosh lugin. We'll see why that's the case. What if a person was talking about yayin and it was pirashi ben yodeh ma pirashti? What should he do if he doesn't know how much he promised? Says the Gemara, Yavi Kiyom Meruba. You need to bring like the day where there was the most wine. It's quite a bit of wine, as we'll soon see. Tanu Rabban, and the Gemara opens halfway down in Kuf Zayin Amud Aleph, Ezrach, extra word in the pasuk. Really, this pasuk was speaking about Menachos. What does the word Ezrach teach us? Malamish misnad ben yain. That even though the pasuk was talking about yain, we have an extra word of Ezrach that teaches us we're allowed to give wine. Bekama minimum shiur shlosh lugin, like we saw in our Gemara, which Rashi articulated was the minimum shiur of Nesachin. Minayin shimrat l'hosif Yosef. How do we know that if you wanted to give more than 3 lugin of wine, you were allowed to? Talmud Omer Yehyeh. From the word, yeah, we saw this exact drush on a couple of blot ago. Yachol yivchos. Maybe we could bring wine in a measure less than 3 lug. Talmud Omer, you're not allowed to do that. Kach, it has to be at a minimum shiur of 3 lug, nothing less. What about shemen? This we saw machlokes tanaim. Shemen, we said lo yivchos min halug, that it has to be 1 lug according to the Tanakhama. Rabbi Omer shlosh lug, and according to Rabbi it was 3 lug. What are they arguing about? Put on your thinking caps for just a moment. Amro rabbanan kamid Rav Papa bedomino mina ve'ukim be'asra kamifli. They're dealing with a style of analytics, a style of drasha where we can learn things out. According to the first approach of domino, we can learn 2 things from the bridge between oil and mincha. And according to the second approach of domino uki ba'asra, one is we learn only 1 thing from there and not 2. Let's see how this plays out. Says the Gemara 2/3 of the way down. Rabbanan sabre domino mina. We're able to double learn shemen from mincha. Ma mincha misnadven af shemen nami misnadven. Just like by a korban mincha, you're allowed to give that as a volunteer gift. You can give that as an adava. So to oil. And umino, we can learn a second thing. What is that second thing? Ma mincha belug af shemen belug. That's why the Tanakhama holds that shemen is lug also, because he says we double learn. It's don mino umino. However, Rebbe sabar domino uki ba'asra. No, you're only allowed to learn 1 thing, but then you leave it in its place, and then we learn oil from somewhere else. Let's see what his drasha is. 3 lines before the wide lines. Ma mincha misnadven af shemen misnadven. Yes, I agree to the first part of the Tanakhama's learning. That's don mina, which is that just like we're allowed to give an adav of mincha, so too we can give an adav of shemen v'uki be'asra. But then we stop learning from there. And then what do we do about the oil? There we learn from kinesachin. We learn oil from not from mincha anymore, because he holds you can only learn 1 thing from it, because he holds domina v'uki be'asra. Therefore, where do we learn about the oil? Kinesachim, like libations, manasachim shloshes lugin, af shemen nami shloshes lugin. So again, these are unique types of limudim. They are found throughout Shas, probably 15, 20 times if I had to rough sketch. I don't know exactly, but it feels like about that much. But we see this concept come up a number of times. It's a very unique way to learn about the scope of what we're allowed to learn from one topic. That is the explanation of our machlokes of why shemen, according to the Tanakhama, is 1 lug versus, according to Rebbe, which is 3 lugin. Last of the short lines, Amar Luhu Rav Papa. Rav Papa says, I don't agree that this is the svara, that the machlokes is domino versus domino uki be'asra. Because after all, he holds imi mincha gamar la Rebbe. If Rebbe's taka learning from mincha, then the kule amalo pligi domino mina. Then everyone would agree that we would say domino mina. It doesn't get into the svara of why. Says the Gemara, Ela Rebbe may Ezrach gamir lo. He actually learns it from Ezrach, and that's how he learns that shemen is 3 lugin. Amar le Rav Huna bereder Rav Nasan le Rav Papa umi matzes amar sachi. Could you actually say that Rebbe learned from the word Ezrach about shemen being 3 lug? Absolutely not. V'atanya, in regards to mincha, it says korban malamin shemisnad ben shemen v'kama shloshes lugin. What was that pasuk talking about? Mincha. So Mechatesi, you can say that he learned it from Ezrach. You can't do that. He has to say that he learned it from here. And man shama say damar shloshes lugin Rebbe v'kamaisi lami korban. So says the Gemara. when Rav Papa said this, he got pushed back from Rav Huna Bered to Rav Nasan. And what does Rav Papa do? He's contrite. You're 100% right. Amar le, Tanya, if you have a brisa like that, it's very hard for me to argue. I was giving you a svara without a mari makom. You want to bring me a mari makom that's stronger? No problem. Look at the integrity, just the simplicity. I was wrong. Thank you very much. Let's move on, And he clearly didn't know that brisa. It's hard for us to imagine that there were Amoraim who didn't know brisas. It's so hard for us we know brisas that they never saw. There are plenty of Amoraim who never saw brisas. It's an unbelievable thing that Rav Papa didn't know a brisa. Mishnah is Baal Peh. Well, they were never codified into one book. They were never even collected. We only have the Tosefta. Piyashmu, exactly. They were in the dark, especially the early Amoraim. They really were in the dark.
If your Rebbe didn't hold it,
he didn't even teach it. I mean, from the Rebbe perspective, it wasn't always exactly like Rabbi Yehuda Nasi had it. Prior to writing down the Mishnayos the way that we know them, they were not taught in that format by and large. They were taught whatever Tanaic source the Rebbe held. That's what he taught. And so we are seeing a sliver of humanity that Rebbe only taught the Mishnayos the way he saw them. We couldn't possibly learn Shas without brisas to compare and contrast. Okay, says the Gemara 4 lines from the bottom as we're ending out this section of Gemara. Pirashti ve'ena yodema pirashti yavi kiyom meruba. We said in our Mishnah that if you made a commitment of bringing wine, but you're not sure how much you brought, you're in big trouble. Says the Gemara, how much do you have to bring? Tana kiyom tov harishon shel chag shechalios b'Shabbos, first day of Sukkot, that falls out on Shabbos, and that was, I guess, a lot. It doesn't say in the Gemara how much it was, but it wasn't a small amount. Next Mishnah.
Or they said, if it were a similar case, you do like one less than that, no? They said like,
what do you mean one less?
Well, I forgot what the case was. The Shishim. Because
yeah.
Like it wouldn't be much.
That was about Belila, though. That was about whether or not it's actually mixable.
In the end, they switched.
Well, that was Reb Shimon. The Havamina was we have to do one less than they do. Reb Shimon rejected that. Reb Shimon said the reason why that's not allowed is because it's not Belila. And then the Gemara said, well, who cares if it's not Belila? It's kosher anyways. The Gemara said it has to be Roy Lebila. But 61 was not Roy Lebila. And then he said Ad Khan. The Gemara said absolutely Ad Khan. That's Amidas Ad Chachamim.
But like in the Havamina,
it's not just Havamina. The Tanakama held what you're saying. Yeah. So he held that you had to be one less.
Right. It is interesting.
It's not that you had to be one less in total. It's you were one less in one kli. 60 over here and one over there. Just you couldn't do 61 in one kli. The total was still the same, but the Tanakama over there held that it had to be broken up into two kelim because we did 61 on Shabbos shel Chag or Yom Tov Rishon shel Chag shel Shabbos.
He doesn't say how much it is, but he says how many korbanos you bring on that day, and then you should be able to extrapolate from that how much wine.
Multiply.
It's 13 parim, 14 fusim, 2 elim.
So it's 13 times 6.
2 musaf.
Yeah. You got to look at all the animal types, and it's 3, 4, and 6. 3, 4, and 6 relative to the size of the animal. Whatever. It was a lot. I think Rabbi Resnick actually mentioned the amount, but I glossed it over. And
first day of Sukkot, because the korbanos go down. So the first day of Sukkot is more, and then you throw in the Shabbos.
Shabbos added a couple also. Yeah. Person says 4 lines from the bottom on Kuv Zayin and Aleph. Again, we're going to be Emir Tashem heading to the bottom of Kuv Ches and Aleph. Still have some work cut out for us. Says the Gemara, Harei alai ola yavi keves. You can bring the smaller animal. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah disagrees. Omer, Otor, O ben Yona. You can bring the smallest one. We'll see soon in the Gemara. They're actually not arguing. Why that's the case, we'll see soon. Let's say you said some language about an ola, but it was pirashti mina bakar ve'eno dema pirashti. I knew it was some type of bakar. Was it a bull? Was it a calf? I have no idea. Ve'eno dema pirashti. You have par ve'egel. So you bring a cow and a calf. You bring both. Same animal type, large and small. What if a person in regards to an ola did not say mina bakar, but he said minha behema ve'eno dema pirashti? So the Gemara says yavi par ve'egel ayel soyer gedi utzla. You're stuck here because what are you supposed to do? You made an obligation to bring an ola. We don't know what your kavanas were, and the Gemara says you got to do everything, and there isn't one animal that patters you up for all of them. What if pirashti in regards to an ola ve'eni odem ma pirashti? So says the Gemara, mosif alein Torah ben Yona. If your language was still broader, you have to add in the birds. That was the sheet that we saw in the beginning of the Mishnah. Who was that? That was the Shita of Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah. What about another category? Not a Toda, not an Ola, but Harei Toda Ushlamim Yavi Keves. If you are vague, you have to bring a Keves. Pirashi min Abakar, Beni Dema Pirashi Yavi Par Upara Egel ve'Egla, because the Toda can be brought in both genders, so now you have to double the animals. You have to bring males and females. That's why it's parpara. That's a bull and a cow. Egel ve'egla is a calf and a female calf, male and female. What if you said mina behema ve'eni odem apirashti? Buckle up. You have paru para, egel ve'egla, aisle urechela, seir useira, gediu gedia, telev italia. You have to bring everything. You have to all 5 animal types, male and female, because you have to cover all your bases. You made a nether. Note to self: don't make a nether. And if you do, be exceedingly specific in what it is that you plan on doing. 8 lines down, Kuf Zayin Base. Harei alai shor, yavi hu unisachav b'mana. So here the Gemara says that if a person says you have to bring a shor, you have to bring it with its nisachav b'mana. And it has to be the dollar amount of a mana. This is a very interesting piece of Gemara that it says mana. The Rishonim here debate why it is that it says that way. Whether or not it's halach l'mosh misinai, not for now. Egel, if a person says harei alai egel, yavihu unesacha b'chamesh, you have to bring for 5 sela worth, and the wine was included in that number. Ayel, if you committed to bring a ram, yavihu unesacha b'shtayim, it has to be 2 sela, wine is included in the cost. Keves yavihu unesacha b'sela. However, if your line was not just harei alai shor, but you said shor b'mana, so then the wine is not included. Then yavi b'mana chutz minasacha. Then things change because you specified that you were going to bring a mana. Egel b'chamesh, if you said I'm bringing an egel, I'm bringing a calf, and it's worth 5 sela, then yavi b'chamesh chutz minasachav, then you bring 5 selas worth, but the wine is excluded from the cost. Milevar. Ayel b'shtayim, same exact thing. If you said a ram is going to be worth 2 sela, yavi b'shtayim chutz minasachav, the wine is excluded. What if you said keves b'sela, yavi b'sela chutz minasachav, same exact thing. Says the Gemara, shor b'mana, if you say that, v'hevi shnayim b'mana lo yatsa. If you said shor b'mana, so the shor is worth 100, and you got a deal, and now you got 2 shvarim for a mana, not enough. Lo yatsa, why? You didn't do what you said. A shor with it, which is worth a mana. Right? So you got a good deal, except that you weren't yote your neder. Even if it's only missing a tiny amount, it doesn't matter. You're not yote. If you make a commitment of bringing a shor b'mana, you need to bring a shor b'mana. You need to do that. That's what the Gemara says. Shachar behevi lavan, lavan behevi shachar, gadol behevi katan, lo yatsa. However, katan behevi gadol, that's a machlokas. If you committed to bring a small amount and you brought a larger amount, Tanakama says yatsa, Rebbe Omer, lo yatsa. This brings us to the Gemara, a third of the way down on Kuf Zayin Amud Beis. Below Pliki, what is this talking about? Flip back to the Mishnah on Kuf Zayin Amud Aleph. We saw Machlokas at the open of our Mishnah. The Mishnah over there said that Harei alai ola, the Tanakama said you bring a keves, or Belazar ben Azariah said you bring a bird. It says the Gemara over here, Velo Pligi, Marki Asre, Marki Asre. In different cities, the cheapest bird might have been different, the cheapest animal might have been different things. So whatever it was just cheaper, and that was what they had. Maybe they didn't have access to certain animals in certain locales, I don't know. When I was in Shalvim, there was a Rosh Yeshiva there who learned a very, very lengthy rush, and he pointed out that the rush traveled throughout his life. He noted that one section of the rush had to be when he lived in city X because of Metzias 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The second piece of the rush was in city number 2 because in that city, he knew what was going on in every city. So he said the rush was written over a period of years. Fascinating, totally off the beaten path. But this is exactly what the Gemara is saying over here. Marki Asher. This city didn't have keves, or this city didn't have birds. But they were saying, the point is you can bring the least expensive one to check a box. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught us in a brisa. A person said, Harei alai ola b'sela l'mizbech. A person says, I'm going to bring an ola that's worth 1 sela to the mizbech. Yavi keves. She'en chadavar she'kar b'sela l'gabi mizbech al keves she'kar b'sela. That is the least expensive in that way, that it can be brought for only 1 sela. What if in this regard a person said pirashti v'eni odem pirashti? Yavim mikol davar shekar b'sela l'gabe mizbech. You can bring anything. If you didn't specify what animal, you just said sela. Bring anything that's worth a sela, no problem at all. At the 2 dots, our Mishnah had said pirashti min abakar v'eni odem pirashti yaver par be'egel. This was in regards to an ola. Person said harei alai ola, but they weren't sure which type of animal. They knew they said a bakar, but remember we said you have to bring a large animal and a small one. Amai v'leisi parmi manavshach. Just bring the bigger animal. Says the Gemara, Hamani. It must be that this Mishnah is Rebbe, because after all, what does Rebbe hold? Damar katan v'hevi gadol lo yatsa. So you were vague. If you would have said, bring the large animal, Rebbe holds you're not yotze. Why does Rebbe hold you're not yotze? Okay, we're going to discuss that shortly. Says the Gemara, Rebbe, if it's true that this part of the Mishnah, Pirashti, Ben Yodea, Ma Pirashti, in regards to the Bakar is Rebbe, well, Ema Seifa, Rebbe's name comes up again later. What do we say later? Shor b'mana, and we said, Behebi b'shnayim b'mana lo yatza, ve'afilu zeh b'mana chasar dinar, v'zeh b'mana chasar dinar. We had said that Rebbe holds that even if you're missing one little dinar off of a mana, you're not yotze. Shachar behebi lavan lavan behebi shachar gadol behebi katan lo yatza. And then we said katan behebi gadol yatza. What does Rebbe say? Rebbe Omer lo yatza. Now, if the flow of our Mishnah is right like that, the Pirashi over here in the Mishnah is Rebbe, and then we see a Machlokes, and then we see Rebbe again, then says the Gemara, Reisha v'sefer Rebbe Mutziyasa Rabbanon. The structure of the Mishnah is wacky. It doesn't flow. Say all the Rebbes together. Why are you breaking things up? Says the Gemara. Absolutely right. 10, 12 lines from the bottom. Reisha v'sefer Rebbe Mutziyasa Rabbanon. V'achi kamar. All we're pointing out over here is the fact that we have a significant Machlokes. The davar is a Machlokes Rebbe v'Rabbanon in regards to this last piece of the Mishnah, that this machlokes of katan vehebi gadol, that Rebbe holds you're not yotze, but the Tanakama holds that you are. Good. That brings us to the two dots, about 7-8 lines from the bottom by the parentheses. Tanan Hasan, we have a Mishnah, Shisha Nadava. We know this from Shkalim, we saw it already, that there were 6 containers that Nadavos were collected from, Keneged Mi. We're going to now see here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different answers that are going to discuss this. What were these containers? That there were 6 Batei Av of Kohanim, and there was one container for each one. Each container was for the Olas Ketz Mizbech. If the Mizbech was having a slow day, they didn't want it to be, it was a chutzpah to leave it empty. We've seen this in Shas a number of times. So they would take a korban, they'd take money, they'd buy an animal, they'd throw it on. So there was a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday box, because we didn't want the Kohanim to argue. So the Chizkiah says each 6 was connected one base av sheyeh shalom zeim zeh, so that there's no machlokes. Remember, the Kohanim get the hides of the Ola. So this was what they were most concerned about. I mean, on the Kohanim side, they were concerned about halacha, but they had a perk. It was a perk. It's like saying to someone at work, you don't get medical benefits. No, I want the hides. So that's what Chizkiah was concerned about. We'll see a little bit more about this later. Rabbi Yochanan Amar mitoch shenadav meruba tiknu them shofaros merubim k'dei shelo yisapshu hamos. He says nothing to do with the Kohanim. He said all the coins, if there was any moisture, they would begin to mold. So we needed to have some, and they would spread them out so they weren't so condensed, they weren't so packed, they wouldn't trap so much moisture. It was shaped like a shofar, narrower at the top, wider at the bottom. It wasn't exactly airy. Obviously we don't have these problems with our coins by and large, although I have seen some nasty coins in the day, as we all have. But that's what they were worried about. Their coins were not high quality. Uzi'iri Amar, third answer, Keneged Parve Egil Ayel V'Keves Gedivas Soyer, the 6 of them, V'Rebbe Damar Kartan V'Vigado Lo Yatza. And this was to say that there were Shishal and Adava. Each of them were dealing with one of these particular animals. Ubar Padamar Keneged Aparim V'Eilu V'Akvasim V'Seirim V'Hamosaros V'Ama. He says that it was about something totally different, which was in all of these cases. And if you look at Rashi, you'll see over here, let's just do one because it will paint the picture. Rashi, 5 lines from the bottom of Kuf Zayin Bezi Ramaschal Keneged Param. Shalchata Sibur Sha'avdu V'Hivu Shachem Tachtem Achar Kach Nimtzori Shonim V'Niskan L'Riyah Dmei Noflan L'Shofar Rishon. So this first animal, you replaced it, you found the original, you cashed out the one that you had the replacement, and you put that money in bucket number 1. So bucket number 1 was parim. It was the monies from the cashed out replacement par when you found the first one. That was bucket number 1. V'ha'elim, same thing. V'ha'kvasim, same thing. V'ha'seirim, same thing. V'ha'mosaros, extra animals, same thing. V'ha'ma, we're going to discuss that in a little bit. V'ha'ma, that was also the same thing. Rashi points out over here about 15 lines down in Rashi, this was the kolbon. The kolbon, as you may recall from Maseches Shkalim, was like a surcharge of sorts. When you would give the chatzi shekel, we were concerned halachically that perhaps because you were paying by actual weight of silver, you're paying by weight, and we don't pay by weight. Our coins have a conceptual value, not an inherent value. We say a quarter is a quarter. They don't measure it by weight, by down to the gram. We don't do that. So the kolbon, when you're measuring by actual weight, you're not yotze the chatzi shekel. If you give less, even if it's worn down a little bit, they give a kolbon to make sure that there were extras. So that there was a kolbon that would get put into the 6th of these containers. Now, these are the first 4 answers. Let's say why each of them don't hold like each other. Top of Kuf Ches Amud Aleph, top line. Kulu kechizkiya lo amri. None of the other 3 Amoraim held like that. That's Rav Yochanan, that's Zeiri, and that's Bar Pada. They didn't agree with Chizkiya. Why not? Because la ansuye lo chayshinan. The kol chad b'chad yom ekavid. Nobody knew what was happening on the other days. The Kohanim from Monday had no idea what happened on Tuesday. They weren't there. There's no fighting. Nobody knew how much money they took out of the Yom Rishon box. They had no idea. So there was no fighting. So they didn't agree. Rabbi Yochanan no Amra, the other three disagreed with him. That's Chizkiah, Zeiri, and Bar Pada. They disagree with Rabbi Yochanan because Leipushe lo chashinon. I disagree. They don't. The coins don't mold. What is this? A question of Metzias? I don't know. Rabbi Yochanan held it was a problem. Nobody else did. Ki Zeiri lo Amra, the other three didn't hold like him because Zeiri was of the opinion ki Yechida lo mukmi. He held like Rabbi, who was a das yachid. So therefore, he's a das yachid. And Ki Bar Pada lo Amri because mosaros kulhu nami mosaros. All of these are mosaros. Nobody agreed to him that there was a box called mosaros. What does that mean? This whole thing is mosaros. They're all extra dollars. Good. Says the Gemara, ma nami l'shkalim azla. The kolbon, the extra dollars that the surcharge coins would also go into that bucket. Titania lehechen kalbon zeholech. Where did the kalbon go? Says the Gemara, l'shkalim divrei Reb Meir and Reb Elazar Amar lenadaba, but it never went into the boxes. He disagreed. He disagreed that the kolbon went there. So therefore, he disagreed with the shita of Bar Pada. Let's see a fifth answer. Ushmuel Amar Keneged Mosar Chatas, Umosar Asham, Umosar Asham Nazir, Umosar Asham Metzora, Umosar Menchas Chote, Umosar Asiri Sa'ifa Shel Kohen Gadol. All of the extra dollars after the donation was made, if there was change left over, 6 boxes for Nadava for each. Rabbi Shaya, the sixth answer of the Gemara about how each of these 6 boxes were used. Omar, he said Keneged Mosar Chatas, number 1, similar to Shmuel. And Umosar Asham, similar to Shmuel. Umosar Asham Nazir, similar to Shmuel. Umosar Asham Mitzora, similar to Shmuel. Now we break. Reb Oshaya holds Umosar Kinim, extra for birds. Clearly, Shmuel didn't hold that way. Umosar Minchas Chote, which he agrees to Shmuel about, but Shmuel had one that Reb Oshaya didn't agree about. Shmuel's sixth one was Asiri Sa'ifa Shel Kohen Gadol. So Lemaisa, the difference between Reb Oshaya and Shmuel is that Shmuel held that one of the 6 was Mosar Asiri Sa'ifa Shel Kohen Gadol, leftovers of the Asir Sa'ifa that was given for the Kohen Gadol, and Reb Oshaya held that didn't apply, but instead they had Kinim. Ushmuel, my time alo Amar Reb Oshaya. Why is it that Shmuel, who ignored Kinim, why did he not hold like Reb Oshaya? Because Kinim, Tanale Resha. We had that in the other set, not in these 6, but we had Kinim in the other set of Kalim. Reb Oshaya, Tani velo Tani Kinim? Well, I don't understand. Which category was it in? Tani Reb Oshaya, but Tani Kinim. We know that he said Kinim in the first section too. So we had these 7 shofros and we had these 6 shofros. They were in both? Says the Gemara, yes. Reb Oshaya Taka held that there were 2 different buckets for kinim. One was lekinim, the initial box for monies that were for kinim. V'chad lemosar kinim, one was for extra monies after purchasing kinim, but for monies that were earmarked for kinim, then they were put into the mosar kinim. They were put back into one of those shofros. Okay, that's why Shmuel didn't hold like Reb Oshaya. Says the Gemara, a third of the way down. Reb Oshaya, my time alo Amar Kishmuel. Why is it, Reb Oshai, that you didn't hold like Shmuel to include the case of Mosar Asir Seif Shel Kohen Gadol? Why was there no box of Nadava, no shofros for the extra monies that applied to the case of Asir Seif Shel Kohen Gadol? Says the Gemara, Savar La Command Amar Mosar Shel Asir Seif Shel Kohen Gadol Yirkav. He said it would never be put there. Titania Mosar Minchas Nadava. Mosar Mincha Yirkav. My Amar, what does this cryptic Mishnah mean? Mosar, the extras of Minchas Nadava. What's Minchas Nadava? What is that weird? That's not a phrase. Minchas Nadava. What are we even talking about? And that it should be Yirkav. My Amar, Amar Chisa Hachi Amar. Mosar Minchas Chote Nidava. Mosar Asiri Seif Shel Kohen Gadol Yirkav. So we expand that Mishnah to be understood in a way where Rabbi Shaya does not agree with Shmuel. Rabbi Shaya held like this brisa that held that the Mosar Mincha, the Mosar Asir Seif Shel Kohen Gadol, if it was extra, it would go to waste. We would not use it. It would not go into one of the boxes. Rabba Amar, 2/3 of the way down, 4 lines before the wide lines. He says, Afilu Mosar Asir Seif Shel Kohen Gadol Nami Nadava. Rabba also held that it would be given as a Nadava. Ella Mosar Lachme Toda Yirkav. He disagreed with how to understand the brisa, and Rabba disagrees with Rav Chizda, and he holds that really the Asir Seif Shel Kohen Gadol was a Nadava like Shmuel, but the Mosar Lachme Toda was Yirkav, that it would be left to spoil. And this was beplukta. This was a machlokes that was pre-existing. Mosar Asir Seif Shel Kohen Gadol machlokes. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Nidava, Rabbi Elazar Amar Yirkav. Exactly like the machlokes we saw between Rabba and Rav Chizda. That's how to understand. So that's why Rabbi Shaya didn't want to learn like Shmuel, because there was one version of the brisa, which is the version of the brisa that is like the opinion of Rav Chizda, and in the second machlokes is like the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, of Rabbi Lazar, that it is Yirka. First of the long lines, Mesve, hold on 1 second, says the Gemara. Mosar shkalim chulin, umosar asila seifa, umosar kine zavin, v'kine zavos, v'kine yoldos, v'chatos, v'ashamos, mosrehen nedava. All of them are nedava. My lab, isn't this the case that Mosar Zir Sefer Shal Kohen Gadol, that this should be considered Linadava and Kasha and Rabbi Shaya? That doesn't work. This brisa seems to, I mean, it doesn't say it expressly, but we're making an inference that perhaps it's included. It says Gemara lo, Mosar Minchas Chote. It wasn't talking about the case of Asir Seif, it was only talking about the case of Minchas Chote. So it says the Gemara, Rav Nachman, Bar Rabbi Yitzchak Mistabra Command Amar Mosar Asir Seif Shal Kohen Gadol Yirka. Says the Gemara Pashtus, we should hold like Rabbi Shaya, who holds that Shmuel was wrong, and really one of the boxes was not for the Asir Seif of the Kohen Gadol, the Tanya, lo yasim ale Hashem, lo yitin ale lavona kichatasi, because the pasuk says that it's kichatasi. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, he kruya chatas. The minchas chote is called a chatas. Vein acheres kruya chatas. Limaid. What does that teach us? Al Asir Seif shel Kohen Gadol she'ena kruya chatas utuna lavona. It's not considered a chatas, and it requires a lavona. Mideina kruya chatas. Guess what? Mosari Yirkav. And we therefore see that Rabbi Shaya has a beautiful raya, and we seem to not hold like the approach of Shmuel. And therefore, if we had to paskin here, which of course we don't, but if we did, we would have said that Rabbi Shaya's approach was more reasonable to include Kinman and to exclude the case of Asir Seifa Shel Kohen Gadol. That brings us to the end of tonight. We're at the bottom of Kuf Chesem and Aleph. Mir Hashem will pick up at this Mishnah tomorrow night with Shor Zeh. Wishing you all a beautiful night.